So this is Bhagavad-gita, chapter 18, text 59. Somewhere probably someone has the page already and they can shout out what the page is.
The page?
Yeah.
Oh, we have two different versions.
Oh, okay. One of those deals.
So here it's 699. Which page is 828 on the new book.
828. Yeah, you're going to be finished with the Bhagavad-gita. Then what's the plan? You're going to start over? Yeah, okay. So the translation reads, if you do not act according to my direction and do not fight, then you will be falsely directed. By your nature, you will have to be engaged in warfare. So I say, and you please repeat, if you do not act according to my direction and do not fight, then you will be falsely directed. By your nature, you will have to be engaged in warfare. Okay, so the purport reads, Arjuna was a military man and was born of the nature of a kshatriya. Therefore, his natural duty was to fight. But due to false ego, he was fearing that by killing his teacher, grandfather, and friends, he would incur sinful reaction. Actually, he was considering himself the master of his actions, as if he were directing the good and bad results of such work. He forgot that the Supreme Personality of Godhead was present there and instructing him to fight. That is a forgetfulness of the conditioned soul. The Supreme Personality gives directions as to what is good and what is bad, and one simply has to act in Krishna consciousness to attain the perfection of life. No one can ascertain his destiny as the Supreme Lord can. Therefore, the best course is to take direction from the Supreme Lord and act. No one should neglect the orders of the Supreme Personality of Godhead or the orders of the Spiritual Master, who is the representative of God. One should act unhesitatingly to execute the order of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That will keep one safe under all circumstances. Yadahankaram ashritya nayotya iti manyase mityaisha vyavasayaste prakritis tam niyokshati. If you do not act according to my direction and do not fight, then you will be falsely directed. By your nature, you will have to be engaged in warfare. So this 18th chapter is called the Perfection of Renunciation. Is a summary chapter. And Prabhupada tells us that actually the Bhagavad-gita was finished in 17 chapters, but this last chapter adds some recapitulation or rehash of the entire Bhagavad-gita. That way we kind of, after hearing the Bhagavad-gita, we have a retrospective or a review of the various topics with a little bit of new information, but basically it's a tying together of what has recently been spoken in the Bhagavad-gita. As I've sometimes said before, chapter 2 is a summary chapter, and chapter 18 is a summary chapter. So Krishna does a summary before he speaks, and he does a summary after he finishes making his presentation. So before and after. And in the middle, of course, is his actual presentation. And this chapter is from about verse 1 to 12 it's a rehash of the whole concept of karma. Then from 13 through 18, it's a rehash of jnana. And then from 19 all the way to 71, it discusses yoga. In fact, we hear, in a sort of roundabout way, the yoga ladder being discussed in that whole biggest main section from all the way from verse 19 all the way to 71. And then from 72 to 78 are some concluding words from Arjuna and Krishna. So this Bhagavad-gita, this 18th chapter, helps us to kind of understand what is important. This section, which we're in right now, this is verse 59, all the way from verse 50 to about 60 or 61, all that distance, is about the topic of how one should act, what the immediate results will be, and also what the long-range result will be of where you will be situated as a result. So in Sanskrit, there are three basic categories. There's what's called Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojana. So Sambandha is a basic grasp of the precarious situation we're in this material world. Abhideya is to know what to do about that situation. And Prayojana is what will happen when we actually follow through with doing the right thing in the material world. So here we're talking mostly about the last two, about Abhideya and Prayojana, what one should be like. In other words, Krishna describes what a perfected personality would be like, both from the internal characteristics that such a person would exhibit and how they would deal with people on the outside. And then he describes what will be the destination of such a person. Of course, we know the destination will be the spiritual world. Here, we're hearing about something called the Brahma Bhuta platform. That's a few verses ahead, and we might actually get there. The Brahma Bhuta platform is a consciousness where we are no longer really possessed of the illusion that happiness is out here in the material world, and we can get it by having the right things around us. This is such a prevalent misconception that is just so thoroughly entrenched in everybody's consciousness in our modern world that people don't even consider that there might be an alternative. Everybody's idea of what happiness is the idea that somehow or other our senses are surrounded by pleasurable experiences, and that's what happiness is. But nothing could be further from the truth. It appears that way, and certainly we do get some satisfaction from the senses being able to lock on to some particular material object and enjoy some pleasure. But really, happiness is a completely different thing than that. And this is totally unknown in our everyday world. Actually, happiness comes from within. No one can take it away from us. No one can shut it off because it's not dependent on what's going on outside. But to have that kind of happiness, true, lasting, deep happiness, and to be self-satisfied, as is described in the Vedas, to be self-satisfied, one has to be completely dedicated to trying to please the Supreme Lord and to cultivate that relationship with the Supreme Lord. If we're situated like that, then no matter what the circumstances are outside, we will be all right with it. We won't feel disturbed. But because we're still, even if we know better, habituated to thinking of happiness as finding it in some object out here in the material world, we have the tendency to still look for that kind of happiness. And therefore, because we're looking for happiness out here in the external world, then we're subject to the law of supply and demand. If it's there, we're happy. If it's not there, we're sad. If somebody takes the happiness that we thought was intended for us, we're angry at them. If we find ourselves in competition with somebody who's going for the same kind of happiness, we become envious of them and begin to plot for their demise in some kind of way. So this is the way that the material world works, and it's worked this way since day one. Nothing will ever change it, but we can drop out of that rat race. That's a possibility, and that's actually what we should do. And this is what a Brahmabhuta person does. Someone that comes to that level where they're not really interested in the kind of things that most people are interested in. They're not interested in their position. They're not interested in how much they have or don't have. They're not interested in getting ahead in the usual material sense. All these things are understood to be a great way to waste your time. And the material world gives us example after example. You know, the sugar plum fairy comes and dances these little beautiful glittering images before us. We think, yeah, I'm going to go do that. And we chase after it. But it somehow never is what we read about in the promotional material. You know, we see these nice slick advertisements for various kinds of material allurements, and they look so tantalizing, so attractive. But when we actually get it and it comes in the mail, you know, it somehow disappoints in some kind of way. And that's the way all material things are. It's just the way that it really is. But somehow we never cotton on. We just look in the catalog for the next thing, and this time we're sure that that's the thing that's going to do it for us. And in this way, we go from day after day, from year after year, chasing after these things.
That would be Amazon.com.
What's that?
Amazon.com.
Yeah. We're addicted to the Amazon consciousness. And if we really want to get high in Amazon consciousness, we go for Prime. So then we can get free delivery and
Next day.
Right. So this is the way our world works, actually. This is the way our world works. And so we cannot remain inactive. There is a yoga system. And so we're kind of at the end of where Krishna's talking about the yoga system. In the verses preceding this one, we kind of had a sort of a quick look at the yoga system. But if the yoga system was properly followed, then you could really retract the senses from the outside world. This is what the whole point of yoga was. You did these asanas, which, if you've ever actually done hatha yoga, you know how torturous they actually are. I remember when I probably should start doing it again, but somehow I haven't worked my way around to putting that back in my schedule. But as people say, when you do yoga, you hurt in places you didn't know you had places. So some of these postures are very excruciating, but what they do is they stretch the muscles out and purify the nadis or energy channels. And then a person can actually sit comfortably in one position for a long period of time. And that's the whole point of the Hatha Yoga system, that you can actually do that. Now we know that most people who take yoga will never really go that part of it. They may actually perform yoga for some time, but they'll never get into the pranayama and up above into the more esoteric aspects of yoga. Because once you can sit comfortably in one position without motion, then yoga really opens up. And then you can withdraw the senses from the external world. But this will fail for 99.999% of people. I mean, not the yoga process will fail, that it won't help you in physical ways, but that you'll be able to do this, to sit in one position for days at a time and control your breathing. Most people are never going to get there. And that would be withdrawing the senses. The whole point of the yoga system was to withdraw the senses internally. And one could, like, on a carnival ride, one could visit the various internal chakras. There's a whole internal universe that most of us have never seen. We live in the external world, but there's an internal world too, with as many varieties as the external world, but we usually don't go there. Because to go there takes a technology which is mostly lost. And even if it isn't lost, it takes a kind of rigor that most people can't abide. So therefore, we don't go there. But if you could go there, and those who do go there can visit the chakras, and then they can actually come to the heart chakra, and there witness the Supreme Lord in the heart, because he's in everybody's heart. And that was the real purpose of yoga. But before you get to that stage, before you get to the stage where you could actually see the Supreme Lord in the heart, you would get to the stage where you would be able to perform magic. And that's the problem. That once people discover that they can pop the hood on everyday reality and do magical things, at that point, that becomes the goal of yoga, and they're diverted completely from the spiritual path. So that's why we don't recommend this withdrawing of the senses. But if you don't withdraw the senses, you have to engage the senses. And the way most people engage the senses is how we were talking about. We search from one object to another, to another, to another, which is how we waste our lives. But actually, we don't have to do that with our senses. We can engage the senses, but we can engage them in acts of devotion, which is a different thing, which is what the whole Bhagavad-gita is trying to get across. That Arjuna is suggesting that he remain aloof from the battle, which wouldn't work for him. He might indeed sit out the battle, but because he's a warrior and that's his training and that's his mentality, that he would be forced to engage in some other kind of battle or conflict somewhere else at some other time. He would not be able to perform yoga. So this is the point that Krishna is getting across to Arjuna, and Arjuna gets it, as we see that in the very beginning of Bhagavad-gita, in Bhagavad-gita 2.9, Arjuna says, I shall not fight. And then in this last chapter at 1873, he says, I am prepared to act according to your instructions. So he's gone a completely 180-degree shift in his determination. In the 18 chapters of Bhagavad-gita, he went from I shall not fight to I'm prepared to act according to your instruction. So Krishna convinced him. So therefore, acting is not the problem. Using the senses is not the problem. The problem is what we do things for. If we use the senses to find pleasurable sense objects, that's the wrong way to use them, and it will entrap us. If we use the senses to serve Krishna, that's the right way to use them, and it will eventually liberate us. We do not have to sit on a mountaintop like the yogis and go through excruciating hatha yoga followed by days and days of drilling just the breathing process. Most of us wouldn't be able to do that. But instead, bhakti yoga is not about restricting the senses. Bhakti yoga is about utilizing the senses, but utilizing them to serve the Supreme Lord. And at first that seems somewhat foreign and artificial, but if we understand the situation and we start to do it, as time goes on, it seems less and less foreign. And starts to feel more natural, because in fact it is natural. It's more natural than what we do now. However, our real nature has been subverted, and we act out of a false nature, which is what this false ego is about. The false ego says, I am an enjoyer, and I need to enjoy in very specific ways. And therefore, we orient ourselves in that type of attitude, which is attitude that will give us all kinds of problems. But if we change that attitude toward, I have a relationship with Krishna, I'm Krishna's servant, and I'm trying to learn how to serve Krishna, that will liberate us. Even though we're using the very same senses, even though we're using the same objects, even though to outside people we look like we're doing nothing any different than anybody else does. But the attitude with which we do things is what makes the distinction. We may drive cars, everybody else drives cars. We may cook food, everybody else cooks food. We may listen to music, everybody else listens to music. We may hear people speak, everybody else listens to people speak. So it looks like we're doing the same thing, but the purpose is what makes it different. And this is what we mean by bhakti, or devotion. The purpose is different. And the purpose is to please the Supreme Lord with everything we do. We cook food to offer it to Krishna. We use music to glorify the Supreme, or to describe the Supreme. We use cars or technology not to try to make us dazzled by things that are new, but we use it to try to give people knowledge of Krishna and to keep ourselves focused on Krishna. So the same things are being used, and most people would not see what the distinction is there, but it's the attitude which makes the two different. So I'm going to kind of put a bookmark there. Any questions or comments before we go any further? Yeah.
So we understand that by nature we want to be happy,
Right.
and so you're instructing us, or the Gita is instructing us, we should shift the direction of our happiness rather
Right.
than externally. But we see that when we first take up that process, it's like a person has joined us.
Right.
We try to taste it, but we're not getting any happiness there. But I'm impelled to happiness naturally.
Right.
So what do I do?
Right. So as a few verses ago, we heard that there were three kinds of happiness, which was a little earlier in this chapter. And we heard what? Happiness in the mode of goodness is what? Anybody know? Atma.
Satisfaction with knowledge.
Well, yeah, it's happiness in the mode of goodness is appears to be like poison in the beginning, but nectar at the end. Now, what is happiness in the mode of passion?
Nectar in the beginning and poison later.
Right, it's the other way around. It appears to be nectar in the beginning. Anybody ever had that experience? Where something starts out as being, really, wow, this is cool. And then at some point we think, oh my God, how did I ever get messed up with this stuff, I mean, any drug addict will tell you, anyone who ever has any kind of issues with these kind of things, at first it seems really wonderful. We're like this big craze now, vaping, right? New York made some new law, right? That, right. It was something that I've noticed really how many vaping stores there are in the city. You go by them all the time. And people, yeah, right. I was just in what do you call it, in Williamsburg. And there was just one vaping store after another, after another, after another. And I saw an article yesterday, and on the internet that said that New York passed some kind of law against the various flavors, so they can only have one flavor of vaping, and all the vaping people are saying, oh, we're all going to go out of business. And I think, gosh, that would be terrible.
In the middle, the kids are dying, right?
Right. But it's evidently, at least some people say, it's linked to new forms of lung disease of very heavy types, And you see these people with these strange things, and suddenly smoke comes out of them. It's, it's weird kind of little contraptions. I see people sneaking a vape on the subways. I see people walking down the street. Oh no, this is terrible. When I interrupt my own class with my own phone.
It's a nice tune, though.
I'm going to, yeah. Oh, not only that, but it's a ridiculous call. Let me shut it off here so it doesn't happen again. Okay, do not disturb.
Maybe some happiness there.
What's that?
Maybe some happiness if you answer the call.
Oh, yeah, right. So this idea is, it just shows that we think that happiness comes from some kind of particular contact, and but actually, happiness comes from within. And as we hear in Bhagavad-gita, that which starts out as pleasurable but winds up being like poison is happiness in the mode of passion. What is happiness in the mode of ignorance? Anybody remember that?
It starts out bad and ends up bad.
What's that?
It starts out bad and it ends up.
Yeah, there's no happiness at all. It starts out bad and it doesn't get any better, right? So that's happiness in the mode of ignorance. And but usually people don't start out there. That's a default mode, because people who go for happiness in the mode of passion, they wind up with happiness in the mode of ignorance eventually, because they burn out. Just like your vapors, you vape for a while, it's cool, all the cool people are doing it, and you've got flavors like strawberry and all these kind of, it sounds bizarre to people who don't smoke, but eventually, you get cancer or one of these kind of things, then it's not so cool anymore. It's not so cool anymore.
I wonder if there'd be a problem with secondhand vaping.
Right, yeah. Luckily, people still have to do it very discreetly these days. Somehow or other, despite everything in Kali Yuga that's gone so terrible, that somehow our culture has weaned itself off smoking. I remember there was a time when I was younger where you couldn't go into a bus or an office building or even a school without the, ever-present, ubiquitous secondhand smoke everywhere. People were just puffing away.
In your face back in
Right. Or you'd be in a car, and at least one person would be smoking in there. My dad smoked a pipe, so it was like really sort of smokestack stuff. Right. So we see that happiness in the mode of passion starts out as pleasure, but it takes its pound of flesh somewhere down the road. And happiness in the mode of goodness is the opposite. It starts out as we don't really have much of a taste for it, as Murli was saying, And but in the end, it actually liberates us, and we develop a taste for it because this is the natural us. But because we've been jaded and accustomed to artificial happiness, we find it a tough go at the very beginning. And that's kind of one of the tapo divyam, the difficulties of beginning the process of spiritual life. But if one continues, then I'm not lying to you. Eventually, the taste for things in the material world will fade. And we will genuinely feel happy at simple things that are actually good for us, But, right now, most of the things that we have an attraction for are the kind of things that will not help us in the long run. They will bring us down. So there is this kind of hump. And this is described in a number of ways in the Vedas, that ado shraddha tatu sadhu sangata bhajana kriya tanarta nivritisya tata nishta ruchis tataha ata shaktis tata bhavas tata prema abhyudanchate sadhakanam ayam premna pradurbhave bhavet kramaha. There are 9 stages of devotional service. First there's faith, then there's association with devotees. The third is bhajana kriya, or taking initiation from a bona fide spiritual master. Then there's anartha nivriti, the lessening of undesirable things in the consciousness. Then after that there's nishta, steadiness, and finally ruchi. And what do we mean by ruchi? Ruchi is taste. But that means that we have lost the taste for those things which will ultimately bring us down. And we're starting to genuinely feel buoyed up by our connection with things that are actually good for us. So it's a tough go in the beginning, but eventually it comes to that stage where we are genuinely attracted to that which will help us in the long run, and we're genuinely not so attracted as we once were to those things which will gradually drag us down in some way or another. So that's part of it. Any other questions?
And how do you develop that trend towards being attracted to what is good for you through spiritual practice?
We are creatures of repetition. Whatever we do over time will eventually have its effect on us. So if the consciousness is directed toward the Supreme, and the activities are those kind of activities that culture or cultivate the mode of goodness, then eventually our whole life will start going that direction. And that's why we learn about the 3 modes of nature. The mode of goodness breeds equanimity, it breeds knowledge, it breeds self-control. The mode of goodness breeds realization. And so the more we can act, think, and mold our attitudes in the same direction as the mode of goodness, the better off we are. The more we're entrapped in elements of the mode of passion and ignorance, to that extent we've got work to do, because those will pull us in the wrong direction. The mode of passion is the mode where we are really interested in how things will work out for our sense gratification in the future. It's like the stock market. We are hoping that our dividends come in, that our stock goes up, and if it doesn't, we are crushed. And if it does, we are foolishly elated because it's just a matter of time where it'll go the other way again. And that's just the way it is in the material world. You never get, things going your way, just boom, 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 boom all the time. You always have things go south at some point. And that's why it's foolish to think that the material world will give us our fix of what we want moment after moment after moment. You know, it will let us down some way or another. And the more specific we are about what happiness we want out of the material world, the more likely that our little glass, you know, fragile menagerie of material desires will get shattered completely at some point. Because the more specific it is, the less likely it is to occur. So that's why people, they don't realize that as they go on in life, their material desires become more and more and more specific, which means they become less and less and less likely to turn out. And whereas a person who has cultivated happiness within is not dependent on the external world to produce some special, tailor-made, customized, experience. Instead, they're happy with things the way they more or less turn out, whatever that is. And they can make the best of it because they know maybe today I have a little bit of austerity I have to go through. I know tomorrow maybe it'll be the other way around. So they're neither completely elated when things kind of go right for a few seconds in a row, and they're not depressed when things go wrong for a few years in a row. But at any rate, it's this kind of equilibrium that comes out as a result of not being dependent on the external world. But you can't fake it. What you can do is externally go through the motions and try to understand the concepts behind it. And eventually, although in one sense you are externally doing it in a superficial way, since it's our true nature, eventually it's not external and it's not superficial anymore. It's genuine. Yeah.
Listening to the verse, it just sounded like it was emphasizing kind of an active approach.
What's that?
Like an active approach to self-realization, that if you're not actively working toward getting closer to Krishna, then
right,
society is just going to blow you further and further away.
Yeah, it's kind of like swimming in a river. A river's got a current, and we have to swim upstream. If our society was oriented toward a varnashram system or the proper orientation, then the society would drift us upward of its own momentum. Even people who were a little reluctant would genuinely be pulled along in the right direction. But our society is not that way. Our society is, hell-bent for leather. So instead, we have to swim against the current. And any time we stop swimming, we're being pulled the wrong direction. So, and the point is being made also in Bhagavad-gita that Arjuna's suggestion, as he had at the very beginning of Bhagavad-gita, he withdraw from the battle and go to the forest to meditate, is an impractical suggestion because most of us could not abide a life of internal withdrawal. We couldn't do it, So we have to use the senses. Better to use them in the appropriate manner than try to sit on them, which won't work, So both of those themes are there. One of them is action versus inaction. The other is swimming upstream against the pull of a culture that is going the wrong way. Yeah.
So given you're going against the culture, association with people who also pursue the same is very important, isn't it?
Right. That's why.
Gives you strength.
Yeah, we need good association, and then we see, well, it's working for so and so and so and so. So they haven't blown up or gone crazy. The people haven't come and pulled them away in a van or something like that and put a nice little suit on them and that kind of thing. So we see that it is actually working for people, and we have confidence. And maybe it'll work for me too. So this is the basic idea of spiritual life, and it really does help. It's very important. Lord Chaitanya and the Acharyas actually make a strong point in the Nectar of Devotion, it describes the idea of association being very important in devotional service, because when you're with like-minded people, then you tend to head in the same direction. And everybody does that. And Prabhupada says, you know, if you go into the stock exchange, you'll hear businessmen talking. As Prabhupada uses the example that, you know, they're not talking about Bhagavatam. And they're talking about business. And he says, it's natural. When businessmen get together, they talk about business. And when devotees get together, they talk about Krishna. And when other groups get together, they talk about whatever the focus of that group is. It's natural. And this is how we can use our tendency to congregate as a way to pull us forward.
In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Kaviraj Goswami says, Krishna Bhakti Janma Mula Hayasava Sangha, the root cause for bhakti is association with devotees. Then he goes on to say that even when you're on the platform of praying, that association is most essential. So at every point in the way, it has to be there.
Sometimes you get those feelings of, the devotees are just so hard to get along. I got to get out of this, you know. And then you realize, oh, you know, I'm actually drifted. We begin to forget, and sometimes because we make offenses, people actually begin to feel that way strongly. And Krishna is inspiring them to get out from devotees where they're going to cause some problem, you know. They think that they are making their own decision to get out of the association of devotees, but actually the Supreme Lord is prompting them like an usher to get out of the movie house, you know, so because they're going to create a problem. Of course, sometime later, a person will come to their senses and realize that it wasn't them, it was me. And then the person will eventually come back. But, you know, in the interim, the material world is not a happy place, and once we leave the association of devotees, we'll discover that things didn't change that much from when we originally left the material world and came into the association. It ain't that pretty out there. You've got all this kind of craziness going on. I mean, these days it's just so obvious. You've got the political circus that we're going through right now, and you've got you know, the pollution of the environment, and you've got poisons going on, people talking about 5G is going to fry all of our little tiny brains just so that we can have the Internet of Things, and all this kind of stuff. Is just, you know, the whole thing is a horror story from one side to another. So at any rate, we begin to realize that, all right, so it was me, it wasn't them. Then we come back and we're a little bit more careful about not committing offenses again.
Jiva Goswami says that the only reason someone leaves the association of devotees is because of offense. Right.
So we imagine that we're leaving because they've offended us, but really we're leaving because we've offended them. Keep that in mind. It's one of those things that's easy to forget. Yeah.
I just recently happened to read, but I didn't really went through all of it, about Mirabai, that actually, I mean, it's by history we know that she was very special and devotee of the Lord. But then there is another opinion that she was not associated with anyone. So was she really?
Well, we're talking about very special cases. Some, you know, wherever you talk about anything, there's always those outlying cases which kind of don't fit the usual pattern of stuff. So, you know, but generally that's the way we talk, that those who are devotees will associate with devotees and try to, you know, make progress. And when we become offensive, then we want to kind of get away from devotees because we think there's something wrong with them. Of course, as I always put, there's a very wonderful Buddhist proverb about how they wash potatoes in Korea. You know, the Buddhists, they fill up a tub full of potatoes. They fill a tub full of water and they put the potatoes in there. Then they jiggle the tub around and the potatoes knock the dirt off one another. And I'll leave it to you to kind of understand the metaphor there. But it's quite, graphic. And it's kind of, I think that's what's going on, just as, we find it irritating or difficult to be with some people. They may find the same thing with us. And just as we learn that, all right, maybe it's, I have to learn how to see this in a higher light. And just as I'm going through things that maybe irritate somebody else, maybe they're going through things that irritate me in some kind of way. And eventually we come to a more kind of equal-minded way of looking at things.
Bhaktivinoda said a very nice thing. He said that when I see a fault in others, I understand my heart is honeycombed with that fault.
Is what?
Is honeycombed with that fault.
Uh-huh.
So that when we see something, we should look inside first.
Right.
Because that's where
Right.
it is.
Any other quick questions, and we can move on a little further here in this. This is an interesting chapter because, as I say, it's kind of a recapitulation or a summary of the entire Bhagavad-gita. And Burijan, in his Surrender Unto Me, his explanation of Bhagavad-gita, he describes the yoga ladder, which is kind of encapsulated here in this 18th chapter. So at the very bottom of the yoga ladder, we have what we call animal life. So in Sanskrit, there's this colorful term, Dvipada Pashu, which means two-legged animals. And I'll let you guess what a two-legged animal is. The idea is people who have made absolutely no efforts toward any spiritual development are kind of in that. That's the bottom rung, Dvipada Pashu. People who are living their human life exactly like animals live their animal lives. They're interested in eating, sleeping, mating, and defending, and nothing more. Now, above that are people who abide by some scripture, but they do so more or less as a system of doing a little bit better in life. It's kind of like a morality system or a system of getting ahead. So that's what we call the karma platform. Above that is what we call karma yoga, where we are abiding by some scriptures, some kind of traditional set of religious formulas, but God is in the picture. However, in the karma yoga kind of level, God has a purpose, and that purpose is to make us happy. So this is God is my waitress concept. That's kind of the karma yoga platform. Above that, we have what we call the jnana platform, which people who have come to the jnana platform have finally come to a realization that material happiness is not real happiness. It never lasts, and it doesn't really satisfy us. And they're looking for something else, but they don't know what it is. So that search for the something else is called the jnana platform. And above the jnana platform, there's a platform we call yoga, where people think, well, why do I have to search all these mysterious literatures of various designs and writers? If I just engage in a mechanical system with my body, I can actually come to the bottom of things and have the experience of the ultimate. And that's the yoga platform. Now, above that, finally, we have the bhakti platform, where we now understand that the Supreme is a person, and we understand that the real purpose of the life that we're living is to get in a relationship of attraction and service to the Supreme. And that's kind of the higher end of the whole thing. So these various types of yoga are described, all of them, in the Bhagavad-gita. And each one is a higher step up, and everybody is somewhere on this spectrum of possibilities. Either a person is, a two-legged animal, or somebody is a karma kandi, or a karma follower, or a karma yogi, or somebody is a jnani, or someone is a yogi, or finally someone is a bhakta. But bhaktas are very rare. So usually we don't find many people on the bhakta level. But when a person comes to the bhakta stage, then they are actually making real progress. All the other stages are temporary and will keep a person rotating in the cycle of birth and death. So to surmount or leave the cycle of birth and death, one has to finally come to the bhakta stage, to the stage of doing devotional service. And then, although just coming to the devotional service doesn't mean our job is done, as we all know, we may still understand what we should do, but be far from doing it. So that's wherein lies the rub, as they say, that we have to not only understand what we need to do, but gradually implement it in our lives, which is a little bit of a stretch. Let me put that kind of euphemistically. But as we do it, we're actually becoming more and more purified. It gets easier, and we are making genuine, non-losable progress. And even if we don't complete our effort in this lifetime, when we die, we don't lose it. We are able to pick up exactly where we left off in the next lifetime. We don't have to go back to square one. However, whatever we gain in the material world, when we leave this body, we lose it completely. If we were rich, we don't get to take that with us. If we were famous, we don't get to take that with us. If we were very attractive, we may not get that in this next body. If we were very strong physically, we may not get that in the next body. So no matter if you were a great yogi or whatever it is, generally you don't get to take those things from one lifetime to another. But whatever you accomplish in the way of purification on the spectrum of bhakti, that does remain with you, and you pick up where you left off in the next lifetime. And that's why we see sometimes people make great progress early on after apparently coming to devotional service. They make very rapid progress because they'd already made a lot of progress in a previous life. And now they're just polishing off the last bits of things. So any questions about that part? The yoga ladder, I wanted to kind of bring that out because it's kind of an important thing, because throughout the entire Bhagavad-gita you hear about these various things. Karma yoga, we hear about karma kanda, we hear about bhakti yoga, we hear about astanga yoga, and we hear about jnana. So we hear about these things. This is how they relate to one another. It's kind of a spectrum of things, and one can go from the bottom to the very top without actually going through the stages in between. It's not like one has to go through each possible stage. However, if someone goes from the very bottom to the very top, somehow one is really kind of not at all into spiritual life and suddenly becomes a bhakta. Generally, they will have a lot of difficulties that they'll have to work out, which will mimic some of the stages in between, like the yoga stage or the karma stage or whatever it is. But they're not genuinely a karmi or a astanga yogi or any of these things, because they're actually already situated on the platform of knowing the ultimate goal. Most people don't know the ultimate goal. even people in various religions. You ask them, what is the goal of your religion? Very few people can actually give a solid, cogent answer to that. But in the system of Bhakti Yoga, we have an answer for that, and that is to develop our loving relationship with the Supreme and eventually move to the spiritual world where that relationship is being carried out all the time. Questions, comments?
Don't most, at least the Judaic, Christian, Islamic traditions say that the goal of life is to love God?
Yeah.
So it's not that the goal isn't there, it's just that people get, I guess, diverted from...
Well, one of the biggest problems in the modern religions is there's no idea of God as a person. So when you love God, what are you loving? If God is this something or another that nobody can really describe, then how do you love that? There's this kind of sense of, well, we love him by following his various directions. Of course, that's there. That is a kind of love, no doubt about it. But ultimately, if your life is going to be consumed by a relationship with God, you have to know something about him at some stage. So that's why things just kind of go so far and they sort of plateau out in general. Yeah.
Concept about picking up where you left off. That was one of the most meaningful pieces of this book for me, because it brought so much context to why I had these unusual opportunities in my life to do exactly that.
The interesting thing is that the Supreme Lord has this interesting way of bending and twisting the material world in some pretty bizarre ways sometimes to get us to take up spiritual life, which shows that we have very serious obstacles, generally speaking, to wanting to take up spiritual life. We are so locked into material life that the Supreme Lord has to kind of bend the universe in some strange configurations to make it possible. But if he senses a bit of sincerity, then he does that. And that's one of those things that makes us realize that it isn't just hocus pocus. God stays out of our way because we don't want him, raining on our parade. Our material parade is that we want to do our thing out here. We don't want to see somebody who can do it better than we do it. We're all here on our own little God project. And when, the real God shows up, he just kind of blows us out of the water. So he says, all right, I'll hide behind the scenes and you won't see me. And most of us don't. But when we start making some inroads to regaining that relationship, he gives us some strange little sort of messages, like you got in high school sometimes. Somebody gives you this little strange message or something like that. And then you realize, oh, there is somebody on the other side of this whole deal that is dealing with me in an interesting way. And so first you kind of get a sense of, his ways of doing things, and eventually develop some feeling for him, and then eventually you come to see him just like we would see anybody else. But that's, of course, a high level of devotional attainment. So, not really enough time to get into more verses. I'll just leave it with that one verse that we did. But this whole chapter, chapter 18, the perfection of renunciation, is how we can recognize a person who has genuinely advanced in spiritual life. How do we recognize them? Well, we just back up a few verses here. This is 1854, one who is thus transcendently situated at once realizes the Supreme Brahman and becomes joyful. He never laments or desires to have anything. He is equally disposed toward every living entity. In that state, he attains pure devotional service to me. So Krishna is describing here. Before that, we have being purified by his intelligence and controlling the mind with determination, giving up the objects of sense gratification, being freed from attachment and hatred. Hatred, one who lives in a secluded place, who eats little, who controls the body. Mind and power of speech, who is always in trance, who is detached, free from false ego, false strength, false pride, lust, anger, and acceptance of material things, freed from false proprietorship, and peaceful. Such a person, is certainly elevated to the position of self-realization. So we kind of hear the external description of how such a person, what their bearing is, how they relate to the world around them. And this way we can actually understand how we're doing and what the genuine qualities are of someone who's progressive in spiritual life. It's not necessarily that they can perform magic tricks or read minds or levitate or those kind of things. The real qualifications of a spiritually advanced person are here. They control the senses, they are equipoised to everyone. This is not a common thing that we see. Being equipoised towards everyone is not something we generally see in our world at all. Generally, people are very differential in their relationship to different kinds of people, based usually only on the amount of sense gratification that a person is in a position to offer. So if somebody is able to increase the way we enjoy, then that person we, pick out our label and slap friend on their forehead. And if somebody interferes with the way that we enjoy, we pull out our label and slap enemy on their forehead. And that's basically how it works, So this is why we don't treat people in an equal-minded way. Of course, it is true that we do still, even in devotional life, treat people to some extent differently, but not just according to whether they bring us sense gratification or not. We should treat them according to whether they are devotees or not, whether they are interested in being devotees or not, and if they are actually superior in their spiritual level of advancement, then we treat them in another special way. So that's kind of a short summary there. All right. Any other final questions or whatever, and we'll... Okay. Oh, okay.
So if you want to talk a little bit more. Well.
Okay.
So if you want to talk maybe 10 more minutes.
Okay.
And then do kirtan. Or you just want to do a little longer kirtan and then see what.
Well, we
see
don't
how
have a
long we can go.
mridanga player today.
I can
Okay.
finesse it.
Okay, why don't we do that?
Okay.
We'll just
Sure.
start a kirtan.
Okay.